Hi everyone, it's Delina and happy Asian American Pacific Islander Month, and welcome back to this week's Real Talk. In this episode, I will be talking to you guys about Yellow Peril and Anti-Asian Propaganda. So, let's get started. Starters, what is Yellow Peril? Yellow Peril is a term that was used against East Asians, and it was a racist metaphor to describe how dangerous Asians were to Westerners. The term first came to use in the 19th century when legal immigration had started. Historian Ernest Renan was the one who warned Westerners about East Asians and made sure they were known as a danger to society, even though all they wanted to do was come to America to work and provide for their families. Many people don't even know what Asians and Asian Americans went through because it's hardly ever talked about, but it is something that must be brought up and people must be educated on. One thing that many people don't realize is that East Asians were seen as vicious animals, and the image, the Yellow Terror in all his glory, just proves how East Asians were dehumanized by others. Recently, many of us have witnessed the attacks on Asians and Asian Americans, but we haven't really been doing anything about it. You don't necessarily need to go to rallies or protests, but you can start by educating yourselves on the issue at hand. Now, why is it that Asians and Asian Americans are being attacked? Honestly, there's no reason at all. These are just harmless men and women who are trying to live their lives, but they're sadly getting hurt just because of how they look on the outside. These current attacks aren't the first and sadly won't be the last. East Asians have been attacked for several years now, and this all began during 1871 when Chinese immigrants started to enter the U.S. for work. And even though they helped develop this country, Westerners felt threatened because they were willing to work for a lower price. Since Westerners felt so threatened, the term Yellow Peril became alive, and soon after, the Chinese Massacre began in Los Angeles. During a protest about the massacre, a shootout began between two Chinese groups and a civilian was shot and killed. After this, things started to elevate, and over 10% of LA's Chinese population was either killed or lynched. Before I close out this video, I want to show you guys a quick video about the brief history of anti-Asian racism in America.
There were nearly 3,800 reported incidents of hate toward Asian American and Pacific Islanders.
I think we got a lot more reports than the government would.
The incidents range from verbal harassment to physical assault.
They said, our respondents, that they didn't want necessarily individual redress. They wanted a voice to say, this is happening, and we want policies to stop it.
The deadliest attack happened on March 16th.
Some tragic news, the deadly shootings in Atlanta.
21-year-old Robert Long charged with killing 8 people in 3 separate massage parlors last night.
6 out of the 8 people killed on Tuesday night were of Asian descent.
President Trump clearly stoked the flames of xenophobia against AAPIs with his rhetoric.
Since the outbreak of the coronavirus last year, President Trump tried to shift blame from his own management of the pandemic to China.
I think we have 19 or 20 versions of the name. Chinese flu, Wuhan virus, Kung flu.
When President Trump insisted on using the term Chinese virus, it racialized the virus. It wasn't just biological, it was Chinese, and he stigmatized Chinese people as the carriers of the disease.
I am proud to be Asian. I belong here. I belong here.
This, unfortunately, is not the first time China or Chinese Americans are being blamed for a disease, and racism and violence against Asians has always come in waves throughout U.S. history.
So you can see that in the plague outbreak in San Francisco in 1900. Because the first person in San Francisco to die of plague was a Chinese American, they were sort of blamed and scapegoated for the outbreak, even though the outbreak likely came from Hawaii aboard an American-Australian ship. There were other plague outbreaks, and later on in 1907 and 1908, but because they weren't in the Chinese community, they were squashed much more quickly and taken more seriously by authorities.
Even outside of a virus outbreak, the U.S. is no stranger to anti-Asian racism. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act banned Chinese immigration for 10 years.
Even after that, there were very strict guidelines for allowing Chinese people into the United States that weren't repealed until 1943.
But around the same time, soon after Pearl Harbor, FDR signed an executive order that forced 120,000 Japanese Americans into internment camps. This policy lasted 4 years. In 1982, in Highland Park, Michigan, 2 white men targeted and beat to death 29-year-old Chinese American Vincent Chin because he was Asian. The judge gave the men probation and a $3,000 fine.
Tell that black community looks like. This is what community looks like.
Anti-Asian racism has been an invisible stain in American history. It is often overlooked or minimized.
The Asian American community is left out of public conversation around racial justice. And that's what's unique about this moment that I think you're seeing, unfortunately, because of these gruesome attacks, a movement sort of building among Asian Americans.
But what I've seen Asian Americans do, and which is actually encouraging in this dark moment, is that you can go into flock mode, right? You could go to flight or fight mode, or you could flock. And that's when you gather together to protect each other, when you gather together and stand up to whatever threats you're experiencing. And I see that.
Now, I know that might have been a lot of information, but many of you have not heard it before, which is why May is such an important month. But I can't stress enough that just because May is labeled as Asian American Pacific Islander Month, this doesn't mean this shouldn't be talked about all year round. I hope this was very helpful, and down below there will be some links that I highly suggest you guys take a look at to learn more about this wonderful month. With that being said, I hope you enjoyed this Real Talk. Make sure to follow us on all our social media platforms. See you guys next week, and again, happy Asian American Pacific Islander Month.